You're here because you want to understand what's really going on quickly, efficiently, and that's what we do. Today, we are diving deep into some, well, pretty significant new information about the origins of COVID-19, stuff that's just come to light.
Exactly. We're really focusing on this information released recently by the White House. It comes out of investigations by the House Oversight Committee's Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. And it revisits some long-standing questions, definitely presents some points that, frankly, warrant a much closer look.
Okay. And just so we're clear on sources, we're mainly looking at that White House release, but also touching on some earlier key documents.
Yes, things like the proximal origin paper in Nature Medicine.
Right, the one arguing for natural origin.
That's the one. And also that statement in The Lancet supporting scientists back in early 2020.
Got it. So our mission here, pull out the most critical, maybe the most surprising insights from all this. Help listeners connect the dots without getting totally lost in the details.
Precisely. A shortcut to understanding the main arguments and the evidence being put forward now.
Okay, let's start unpacking. The White House claims about that proximal origin paper. What's the core argument there?
Well, what's really notable is the assertion that this paper, the one strongly pushing for a natural origin, it was, according to this new information, actively promoted by Dr. Fauci.
Actively promoted, meaning?
Meaning the implication is that it wasn't just, neutral science being shared. It suggests it might have been a deliberate effort to push a specific narrative early on, and maybe crucially to kind of discredit the lab leak theory before it really got going.
So potentially shaping the early understanding.
That's the suggestion here, yes. A potentially significant influence on how we all initially saw the pandemic's beginnings.
And I do remember that paper being cited, well, everywhere, by officials, media, presented as strong evidence against a lab origin. Then there's that Lancet statement, February 2020, also pretty firm. How does that piece fit in now?
Yeah, looking at the timeline, that Lancet statement is quite revealing in this new context. It wasn't just expressing a preference for natural origin. It strongly condemned what it called conspiracy theories about a non-natural source.
I remember that language.
And it specifically talked up the importance of rapid, open, and transparent sharing of data. But now, considering what the White House information suggests, well, that idea of rapid, open, transparent sharing, it seems directly challenged.
So it raises questions about whether that early stance might have actually hindered looking at all possibilities.
That's the question it raises, yes. Did it inadvertently discourage a full, open exploration? And it's worth noting, as the White House points out, both that Nature Medicine paper and the Lancet statement, they're still up, still published on their websites.
Okay. So beyond shaping narratives, the White House info also digs into the virus itself, specific characteristics.
It does. A key point they make is that SARS-CoV-2 had a biological characteristic not found in nature.
Okay. Like what?
They don't go into super deep technical dives in the released info, but it strongly points towards the furin cleavage site. This specific part of the virus, well, it makes it much better at infecting human cells. It's significant.
And the relevance of that.
Early on, quite a few experts suspected that this feature, this specific site, might be the result of lab manipulation, not just natural evolution. So this was a major point of debate and a key piece of evidence for those considering a lab incident as, a possibility.
That is a crucial technical point. And it leads to something else the White House noted. The single point of introduction. How's that different from other pandemics?
Yeah, this is where it diverges quite a bit from the typical pattern. Usually with natural zoonotic spillovers, a virus jumping from animals to humans, we see multiple jumps, independent events, different times, different places as it gets established.
Right, like with SARS or MERS.
Exactly. But the White House information suggests the data for COVID-19 points to just one introduction into humans, maybe two at the absolute most.
Which is unusual.
Very unusual for a natural emergence from an animal reservoir. It begs the question, if it wasn't a typical multi-point natural spillover, what else could explain how it started?
Which I suppose inevitably turns the focus towards Wuhan, specifically the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the WIV. What's the essential background there?
So Wuhan is, of course, home to China's premier SARS research lab, the WIV. And what's really relevant here is its well-documented history. They did gain-of-function research.
Gain-of-function, that's the controversial stuff, making viruses more potent or transmissible.
That's the aim, yes.
Yeah.
The White House info uses phrases like gene-altering and organism supercharging. And crucially, there's also a known history there of, let's say, less than perfect biosafety standards. documented issues.
Which obviously adds to the concern about potential accidents.
Naturally, it increases the concern about unintended releases, absolutely.
And adding fuel to that fire, reports of researchers getting sick early on at the WIV itself.
Yes. According to the White House information, there are reports indicating WIV researchers had COVID-like symptoms back in the fall of 2019.
Fall 2019. That's months before the official outbreak at the market.
Several months before, yes. This early timeline of illness inside the lab, it's a pretty significant piece of the puzzle. It definitely intensifies questions about the WIV's potential role.
Okay, so fast forward to now. It's been nearly 5 years, and the White House is emphasizing something else. Or rather, the lack of something. No natural animal source found.
Exactly. And that lack of discovery is significant. In almost all previous pandemics like this, scientists eventually find the animal reservoir, the species it jumped from.
We found it for SARS, right? Civets and MERS camels.
We did. But despite huge global efforts, WHO investigations, everything,
Yeah.
the natural animal source for SARS-CoV-2 never definitively found.
Still, after all this time.
Still. And being almost 5 years out without that key piece, it's highly unusual. It definitely strengthens arguments for a possible non-natural origin. You'd think if it was jumping repeatedly from some animal population, we'd likely have found it by now.
Then there's just simple geography. The WIV and the Huanan seafood market. How close are they, actually?
Geographically, they're about 7.5 miles apart. The lab and the market initially identified as the epicenter.
7.5 miles.
Yeah. Now, look, proximity doesn't equal causation, of course not.
Sure.
But it certainly raises questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It warrants consideration, especially when you layer it with all the other pieces we've discussed.
It makes you think about the odds, yeah. A novel coronavirus emerges just miles from a lab known for studying novel coronaviruses.
Precisely.
Okay, this all brings us back to how the lab leak idea was treated early on, the suppression aspect.
Exactly. As we touched on with the proximal origin paper and the Lancet statement, the lab leak theory, it was frequently dismissed, discredited by many public health officials in the media.
Sometimes quite strongly.
Very strongly. And beyond that, there are reports that discussion about it was often actively suppressed on social media, labeled misinformation.
Right.
This apparent shutting down of what seems like a legitimate scientific question, especially so early in a global crisis, well, the White House information now seems to push back hard against that, given the points they're raising.
And a core part of the WIV work was gain of function. The White House info addresses that head-on.
Very directly. Their assessment is quite blunt. They state that a lab-related incident involving gain-of-function research is, quote, the most likely origin of COVID-19.
Most likely. That's a strong statement from that source.
It is. And they also voice major concerns about how we oversee this kind of research globally.
Yeah.
They call the current mechanisms incomplete, severely convoluted, and lack global applicability.
So recognizing the risks and the inadequate guardrails.
That seems to be the message, yes. A high-level acknowledgement of both the dangers and the current regulatory gaps.
The White House information also zooms in on the EcoHealth Alliance. What was their role again?
EcoHealth Alliance, led by Dr. Peter Daszak. They were a key player in facilitating gain-of-function research in Wuhan. And, importantly, part of this research involved U.S. taxpayer money via grants.
Okay. And there have been consequences for them.
Yes. Based on evidence released by the Select Subcommittee about potential grant violations. NIH grant terms. The Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, started debarment proceedings. They've suspended all federal funding to EcoHealth.
Debarment? That's serious.
It is. And on top of that, it's now known the Department of Justice has opened an investigation into EcoHealth's activities during the pandemic era.
Wow. Okay. And what about the funder, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH? Does the White House info touch on their role?
It does, and it's quite critical of the NIH. It asserts that NIH procedures for funding and overseeing potentially risky research like this are deficient, unreliable, and pose a serious threat to both public health and national security.
Deficient and unreliable. That's also strong language.
Very. They also allege that NIH fostered an environment that might have encouraged bypassing federal record-keeping laws. And in that context, they specifically mentioned Dr. David Morens, who was a senior advisor to Dr. Fauci.
So suggesting systemic weaknesses in how this research was funded and watched over?
That's the picture it paints, yes, concerning weaknesses in funding and oversight.
This is a lot. And then there's this really surprising element about a potential pardon for Dr. Fauci. Explain that.
Yeah, this is quite something. The White House information refers to a full and unconditional pardon issued by President Biden to Dr. Fauci.
A pardon for what, specifically?
It apparently covers any potential offenses against the U.S. that Dr. Fauci might have committed or been involved in related to his official roles during the pandemic. This covers a period from January 1st, 2014, right up to the date of the pardon. Includes his time at NIAID, the White House Task Force, Chief Medical Advisor role.
A preemptive pardon, then,
Yeah,
before any charges.
that's what it appears to be, yes. And a pardon like that, especially a preemptive one, it raises huge questions about accountability, doesn't it?
Absolutely. What are the implications?
Well, it could effectively block any future legal action. It might also limit the full disclosure of information about his actions and decisions during that critical time. Stops the judicial process.
Okay. The White House info also talks about obstruction, allegations against HHS itself.
Yes, there are claims that the Biden administration's HHS engaged in, and this is their phrasing, a multi-year campaign of delay, confusion, and non-responsiveness,
Aimed at what?
aimed specifically at hindering the Select Subcommittee's investigation and potentially concealing evidence that might, embarrass or implicate senior officials. There are even allegations they deliberately understaffed the part of HHS that handles these kinds of oversight requests from Congress.
Intentionally slowing things down.
That's the allegation, yes. A deliberate effort to impede the investigation.
And it wasn't just HHS accused of obstruction, right? The info names Dr. Daszak from EcoHealth and Dr. Morins from NIH, too.
That's right. The White House information lays out specific accusations against Dr. Peter Daszak. Things like obstructing the committee's investigation by providing public info instead of requested specifics, telling staff to limit document production, allegedly doctoring documents,
Doctoring documents.
that's the claim, and also providing false statements to Congress.
And Dr. Morins.
Dr. David Morins is accused separately of deliberately obstructing the investigation, potentially lying to Congress multiple times, unlawfully deleting federal COVID-19 records, and also sharing non-public NIH grant information with Dr. Daszak at EcoHealth.
So a pattern of alleged obstruction across different players.
That's what the released information suggests, yes.
It feels like the overall impact of all this, as the White House itself seems to acknowledge, is, well, a serious hit to public trust.
Precisely. I mean, when you pile up allegations like these, potential narrative shaping early on, worries about research oversight, then accusations of obstruction, maybe even preemptive pardons, it inevitably damages public trust. A significant decline in confidence in the authorities and institutions involved seems almost unavoidable.
Okay. So wrapping up this deep dive, if you had to boil it down, what's the single biggest takeaway from this new White House information?
I think the central takeaway is that this official information coming from the White House presents a really substantial case for considering a lab-related origin for COVID-19 as a strong possibility, maybe even the most likely, as they put it. And beyond just the origin question, it forces serious concerns into the open. Concerns about research oversight, about transparency during a crisis, and ultimately about the accountability of public officials.
Right. This has definitely been a detailed look at something complex and frankly still unfolding. Hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listeners, a clearer map of the key arguments and the evidence that's recently emerged. And maybe a final thought to leave you with as you process all this. Given these revelations, what are the wider implications for how we handle potentially dangerous scientific research globally? How does this change the conversation about government transparency in future health crises? And maybe most importantly, what steps are even possible now to rebuild public trust in the science and the institutions meant to protect us?
Those are the critical questions moving forward, absolutely.
Definitely things to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.